Hey everyone, and thanks for taking the time to check out this video. Today's presentation is going to be a little different than my usual content, as instead of nerding out on historic weapon systems from the comfort of my couch, I'm out here in the woods talking to you about modern enablers, specifically night vision. But we aren't talking about just any night vision today, we're talking about budget night vision. So let's address what that really means. Obviously, the very idea of budget night vision is something of a paradox because you really can't get real deal night vision performance without spending a serious amount of money. That said, there are ways to do it for more and there's ways to do it for less. And today I'm going to be talking about how to do it for less. As additional context for this presentation, I recently watched the T-Rex Arms video titled Lucas Botkin's Budget Night Vision Loadout. And while generally speaking, I think that Lucas has a ton of valuable knowledge to share with the YouTube community, I don't think that budget-conscious shooters will ever be his demographic. While watching that video, I couldn't help but think that I could piece together a loadout which offered comparable capabilities to his at a greatly reduced price point. So with that in mind, I'll spend the rest of this video showing you how I assembled a complete and real-world capable night vision loadout for $2,000, while also sharing some of the tips and tricks I learned while getting into this potentially intimidating but highly rewarding hobby. So the first thing we need to talk about is exactly what people mean when they say a night vision loadout. Basically, a loadout refers to multiple pieces of complementary equipment which, when used together, produce a desired capability. In this case, a night vision loadout includes all of the equipment that a recreational shooter needs in order to have the capability to continue to be a recreational shooter in low light or no light conditions. As such, the night vision loadout that I'm going to be talking about today will not include components like a firearm, sling, or load-bearing equipment for the same reason it won't include components like supportive shoes, a sturdy belt, or a positive mental attitude. Yes, you will need those things, but already having them and being proficient with them was an implied task and a prerequisite for expanding into night vision capability. What this loadout will include is everything you need in order to go from being a proficient daylight shooter to a proficient nighttime shooter, which includes a night vision device, a means to mount that night vision device to your head, a source of infrared illumination, a passive aiming capable optic and mount, and an active aiming capable infrared laser. So let's start breaking this down. Well, we're talking about a whole loadout here. The obvious starting point to that loadout is going to be the night vision device itself. This is where you're going to make or break your budget and establish the beating heart of your night vision capabilities. So how do you get real deal performance without spending thousands upon thousands of dollars? The secret here is to know how to navigate the used market. Deals on night vision exist, and it's possible to partially offset a lack of funds with a combination of patience, knowledge, and sociability. The longer you're willing to wait, the more likely you are to find the best deal. The more knowledgeable you are in the market and the products themselves, the easier it'll be to recognize a good deal when you see one. And finally, the more sociable you are, the more communities you're going to be plugged into, and the more likely you are to connect with honest and reputable sellers. It might not be fair, and it's certainly not consistent, but it is how the used market works. So now let's talk about what general features you should be looking for, and in doing so, I'll show you a deal that I found personally. I should also note that this is going to be the longest and most in-depth section of the presentation, as the night vision device is fundamentally both the most complex and the most important element of the loadout. What you're going to be looking for is a used PVS-14 type unit, which is exactly what I have here. Technically, this is an ITT NightQuest 6015 model, which is a long discontinued product which was once marketed as a entry-level civilian option manufactured by a US-based defense contractor, which at that time was producing similar units under contract for the US military, and still actually exists today under the ownership of L3 Harris. In other words, this unit has good pedigree. Ideally, you're going to want to find something with a Gen 3 image intensifier tube, but there are some pretty nice Gen 2 Plus tubes out there as well, particularly the Photonis Echo series. Gen 2 tubes are particularly useful with supplementary illumination, which, as previously established, will be included later in this loadout. My little 6015 here is a Gen 3 unit. In shopping for a used NVG unit, it's important to have a sense of where that unit is in its lifespan, as these things don't last forever. This is one of the reasons why sociability is critical, because sociability is how you know who to trust and how you meet people who are trustworthy. A Gen 2 unit is going to have an expected lifespan of about 2,000 to 5,000 hours, and a Gen 3 unit should last upwards of 10,000 hours. That might not sound like a ton initially, but once you start to break that down in your head into 4 to 8 hour night sessions, how many times a week do you do that, you'll probably determine that these do have pretty robust lifespans, particularly the Gen 3 versions. As long as you're not looking at a true surplus item, which has a long professional service life, or one maybe that's been disclosed by the previous owner to have been left on accidentally for multiple battery cycles, you're probably going to be good to go in terms of lifespan. Next, you're going to want to be aware that features like manual gain and auto gating are probably going to be out of your price range. To oversimplify what these terms mean, manual gain is basically a brightness setting, and auto gating is a very nice but non-critical feature which helps the unit stay functional and avoid damage due to bright light impulses during use. Obviously, these are great features to have if you can afford them, but forgoing them will allow you to find essentially functional units at a lower price. My NQ6015 here does not have manual gain adjustment. That would typically be a knob right about here, and it doesn't have auto gating either. Instead, this uses automatic brightness control and automatic bright light shutoff, which is part of what made it an entry-level unit at the time that it was marketed and sold. Next up, I should note that you're almost certainly going to be looking for a green phosphor unit as opposed to white phosphor. All I can really say about that is that white phos units are almost always going to be priced higher than an equivalent quality green phos unit, and while most people who have experienced both will ultimately develop a preference for white, it's not a fundamentally important difference, and I actually know some pretty serious operator types who do prefer green. The point here is it's not a make or break distinction, so if budget is a concern, you're almost certainly going to end up with green, and green is going to work fine. This is a green phos unit. So now let's talk about specifications and blemishes. To make a very long and complicated subject as simple as possible, the heart of every night vision device is an image intensifier tube, and every image intensifier tube is fundamentally unique. The exact characteristics of how a tube interacts with light and produces a visible image are as unique as human fingerprints. And unfortunately, it's not as simple as good tubes versus bad tubes or high resolution versus low resolution. That's part of it, but it's also true that highly experienced individuals may develop a preference for certain specification profiles over others, depending on their specific applications and individual taste. The grand nuances of specs are far beyond the scope of this video, but I felt obliged to mention it all the same. What really matters to us today is that reputable NVG units will typically come with spec sheets detailing the exact performance of that particular unit. But if you're looking to save money, your best bet is to find a good unit that doesn't include a spec sheet. I'm going to explain why. Well, obviously this introduces a significant amount of risk and uncertainty. The core principle here is that spec sheets add perceived value to an NVG unit without actually adding intrinsic value. If someone purchases a high-spec NVG unit with a spec sheet and then loses that spec sheet, the actual performance of that unit doesn't magically decrease. Only the resale value decreases. Again, this is where knowledgeability is going to come into play. If you have the ability to sort through the clutter and identify acceptably spec'd units without a spec sheet, that's going to be your best deal. That's also exactly what I have here. This certainly isn't the best spec'd unit that I've ever seen, but I know from having looked through quite a few of these things over my life and career that it's actually a pretty decent unit, and the fact that the original owner didn't have a spec sheet for this only helped me get a better price. So let's touch on blemishes really quickly. The takeaway here is that blemishes, or basically dead black spots in the image, are fairly common, and they usually aren't a big deal. Obviously, the larger and more central these blemishes are, the more problematic they can be, and the smaller and more peripheral they are, the easier they are to ignore. Now, there's a whole grading criteria that some manufacturers use to measure and categorize different blemishes, but what you really want as a consumer is basically just to see multiple clear images looking through the tube against a solid light-colored background, as that's going to give you a really good indicator of the size, frequency, and severity of the blemishes in that specific tube. But once you start to actually use it in a dynamic environment like this, obviously at night, you're going to find that a lot of those smaller specks really just dissolve into the background, and it's really not a big deal. I got lucky with this unit, which is actually really close to being perfectly clean, but I would not have been put off by a few blemishes. In fact, I think this actually has some, but because I use it out in the real world, they're kind of hard to notice most of the time. It's a great compromise to save a little bit of money, and again, as long as they're not super severe, it's not going to make or break your night vision experience. Lastly, some note should be made on housing and build quality. Again, my unit was made by ITT, which is a reputable manufacturer. That said, my unit also uses the old style, less desirable double battery housing, and this housing actually has a non-function inhibiting crack. I'll show a picture of that somewhere, which, depending on how you look at it, not ideal features, but ideal for me because it helped me get the core function of this unit at the best possible price. So to summarize, if you stack up minor detractions and make strategic compromises, it's possible to get a high-performing NVG unit for a lower cost. This particular unit cost me $1,200, and while that's a pretty darn good deal, it's by no means the best deal that I've ever heard of, and I am a normal human being, so if I can do it, you can do it too. For full transparency, I mostly did buy this particular unit for my girlfriend so that we could go on night hikes together, as I also have a pretty high spec Steel Industries built XLSH white Foz unit, which I use personally and really like. But the real thing to be aware of here is that the performance gap between these is pretty darn small. Yes, I prefer this unit, but this is really close in performance. And when you factor in the fact that this cost almost 3 times as much as this, the difference in performance is nowhere near justified by the difference in price. In summary, if you want performance on a budget, be patient, know what you're looking for, and have a lot of friends. You aren't going to get all the bells and whistles, but if you make strategic compromises, it's possible to get really darn close for a good price. So right now we're $1,200 in, and we've already gotten the most important component out of the way. So let's see what we can do to start filling out the rest of this loadout. So obviously, if we actually want to use this thing, we're going to need a mounting platform, and there's a few options for that. For bare bones simplicity or the tightest budget possible, you can always go with something like a USGI Skull Crusher or maybe a Chinese-made bump helmet. But for this particular loadout, even though on a budget, I think we can do so much better than that. My loadout, as budgeted, includes a no-compromise USGI ballistic helmet mounting platform. How is that possible, you ask? Well, what we're looking at here is a homemade CVC to SOHAH conversion, which is a 20-year-old soft trick, which transforms a DH-132 Bravo combat vehicle crewman helmet into a high-speed, high-cut helmet platform. I'm not going to do a tutorial of that conversion in this video, but once again, this is a if I can do it, you can do it type of situation. I've actually got 2 of these things here, and including the shell, the Velcoins, the pads, the straps, these are only $175 all the way built out. What that gives me is a rock solid and comfortable mounting platform with the same ballistic rating as an ACH. Technically speaking, I did supply my own drill bits, paint, and some elbow grease, but again, implied task. Add another $25 for a Chinese knockoff 3-hole shroud, or the surplus Naruto shroud if that's your thing, and we have a no compromise combat proven helmet system for only $200. That's an insanely good value, and it's such an important part of this loadout. As a brief note, I will say that with simple aluminum parts like this shroud, I'm personally okay with going with knockoff Chinese components in order to save money. Some people are understandably reluctant to hang thousands of dollars off of a $25 attachment point. I'm not one of those people. Aluminum is a cheap and easy material to work with. This is not a high stress bearing or particularly complex component. I've personally headbutted the inner skin of a Blackhawk in this helmet directly on this shroud as it was banking at like 190 miles per hour. And I feel pretty confident that this shroud is not just going to wake up one day and decide to melt or something. Again, your mileage may vary, but my opinion is that for simple parts like this, you don't need to spend a lot of money to get baseline performance. I should also note that this particular helmet has some arc rails mounted, and it's got a battery pack in the back. Obviously, that's a little bit of additional cost, although fairly modest. That said, not necessary at all. I only use arc rails on this particular helmet for supplementary illumination. Some people think it's necessary for ear pro, and if that's what you're into, more power to you. I personally, for shooting situations, am not a fan of helmet-mounted ear pro. Instead, I have long since discovered the benefit of setting up my helmets with a horizontal channel inside the helmet so I can wear conventional ear pro underneath the helmet. I'll show you that now. I found this setup to be far more convenient in training environments because what it allows is that I can take my helmet off independently of my ear pro, and that's a really valuable thing in the real world. There are tons of situations in which it can be great to give your neck a break and get some fresh air in your hair without removing your ear pro or having secondary ear pro that you switch to, particularly in a super loud training environment. With that in mind, let's go ahead and do our part to combat tinnitus by adding a $40 pair of Howard Light Impact Sports to our loadout. Technically, this should have been an implied task, but it's also part of the helmet, I guess, so screw it. $40 for the ears, $200 for the helmet. That brings our running total to $1,440. So now we have a badass helmet mounting platform and a badass night vision device, but we need a way to connect them. The good news is that this is the easiest part of the video. Surplus, Noritos, Rhino 2 mount, USGI J-arm. $55 for the pair. Yes, Wilcox Dovetail people will call you a peasant, but honestly, these components work just fine for me, and at the time of filming, they are readily available for the prices I quoted. Rhino 1 mounts will also work, but the Rhino 2 is worth the extra couple of bucks. Just make sure you're getting them used surplus. Don't pay the 200 bucks or whatever they want for them brand new. With that, we got full function on our helmet NVG interface, and we're in for only $14.95, which we might as well call $1,500 for math. So at this point, we have a complete NVG setup for $1,500, but it's not really a loadout without enablers, right? So let's see if we can turn our remaining $500 into a night vision compliant optic with an NVG height mount, IR Illuminator, and IR Designator. As far as optics go, this isn't rocket science. Yes, optics like aim points and EOTechs are going to let you get the most out of passive aiming, but you really don't need to ball out in order to get functional performance. This is another one of those situations where you can get 85% of peak performance for 15% of peak performance cost. Here I have a $120 Primary Arms MD20 Micro Dot riding on a $20 knockoff 2.26 inch riser. The specific model of optic here is not important. I'm actually someone who tends to prefer the HoloSun 407 series for the same price point, and I've also heard good stuff about the SIG Romeo models as well. These are incredibly well-valued optics for daytime use, and while they don't always advertise dedicated night vision settings, they have settings on them which work just fine under night vision and provide a very serviceable passive aiming experience. As a quick note, for those unfamiliar with the terminology I'm using here, passive aiming in this context refers to just using the optic as designed. Passive just means you aren't turning anything on or projecting additional light. You're just using what's already present and available to you in order to aim the weapon. With an extremely dim reticle, holding this up to your dominant eye mounted NVG is going to allow you to use the red dot more or less the same way you would use it during the day. Now, it should be noted that light transmission on optics like these is not great, which means that under some lighting conditions, passive aiming will create a pseudo Binden effect in which the dot and target area are clearly visible, but the actual glass of the optic appears opaque, as if the lens cap was still on. This doesn't prevent the optic from being usable, but it's less than ideal. The problem is that in order to overcome this relatively subtle issue, you typically need to buy an optic which costs at least 4 times as much as one of these, so that's off the table for today. As for the riser, you're typically going to find that an elevated riser makes passive aiming under nods more comfortable, and frankly, that's actually the direction that people are going for tactical shooting under daytime conditions anyway, as it facilitates a more natural neck position and upright shooting posture. I have personally shot under nods using an absolute co-witnessed Aimpoint Comp M2, but a lower 1/3 mount is going to be better, and this goofy tall stuff is growing on me. For full transparency, I did actually purchase this particular riser with the intent of trying it out and seeing if I wanted to buy the real one. This is a $20 knockoff of a $200 product. The problem is that in trying this out, it worked really well. It was perfectly zeroed out of the box. It lines up on the rail great, and it does everything that I thought that the real thing might do, and I'm having trouble getting motivated to spend $200 on something which is going to do what this does. I do feel a little weird about that because I do strongly believe on principle in supporting U.S. companies, especially companies that I'm not already supporting with my tax dollars. But for today, let's just say that budget-friendly alternatives to certain products do exist. And at least in this case, it seems to work really well. In any case, this is another $140, so that's an easy day and an easy way to check off passive aiming. That brings our running total to $1,640, leaving us $360 to figure out active aiming laser and IR illumination. When it comes to IR lasers and illuminators, a lot of people tend to get confused. Most people think of stuff like Army-issued PEC 15s, which have an overwhelming array of modes and dials, and if you aren't already into night vision, the whole concept can be a little confusing. IR, or infrared spectrum light, is just like regular light, except it exists outside of the spectrum, which is visible to the human eye. It is, however, clearly visible under night vision, which makes it an extremely useful tool. An infrared aiming laser, also called a designator, is essentially just an infrared laser pointer. It can be used to designate specific points in the distance, or it can be used as a reference point for active aiming in precisely the same way that a visible laser can be used to aim a firearm during daylight conditions. An infrared illuminator, on the other hand, is essentially just a flashlight in the infrared spectrum, which allows for spotlighting or flooding of light into an area which is not clearly visible under night vision. Because night vision can't actually see in the dark, but rather intensifies small amounts of ambient light, it can be necessary to introduce artificial light into a truly dark environment. For tactical reasons and for the health of the night vision unit, that light might as well be in the infrared spectrum. Designators and illuminators serve separate but essential purposes and can be used independently or simultaneously. Additionally, these features can be integrated into a single multifunctional device, or they can exist in separate standalone devices. Now, the thing we need to clarify is that in the military, both designators and illuminators are typically laser-based. What that means is that they both use a laser to generate the infrared light. Obviously, a laser-based laser designator is pretty straightforward. There's not really another way to do that I'm aware of, but a laser-based illuminator might be a little less intuitive of a concept to grasp, as most of us are familiar with flashlights using LED or even incandescent bulb technology. A laser-based illuminator works by diffusing a powerful laser beam, which reduces the intensity and the focus of that light. The reason all this matters is that military units like the PEC 15 use laser devices which are more powerful than what is available on the US civilian market, as they are capable of causing immediate and permanent eye damage, including blindness, even with brief direct exposure. Having worked in arms rooms in the past, it would always terrify me to see people turning in weapons with uncapped PEC 15s, as to the naked eye, there's no way to tell if it's turned on and waving around a potentially life-changing beam of concentrated invisible light around that room. Full power infrared lasers are scary, scary devices, and a lot of people in the gun community do not treat them with the respect that they deserve, and that freaks me out, to be honest. In other words, I personally actually derive some relief in knowing that most of the folks at my local range don't have such devices, because some of them are barely capable of following basic firearm safety rules, let alone taking responsibility for a full power LAM, or laser aiming module. The good news here is that civilian class laser aiming devices, or designators, work totally fine. Despite being much less powerful than their military counterparts, they're plenty powerful enough to produce a clear, visible aiming point well beyond the reasonable ranges that anyone would use a laser for aiming, and actually the reduction in power can reduce blooming and washing out of targets at closer ranges. Really, the only thing that's lost is the ability to laze targets at multiple thousands of meters. And to quote the great gun tuber Hop, "I barely have friends, let alone close air support. No loss there for me." The fact that civilian class lasers are fully capable of all practical aiming and marking applications, yet are less capable of accidentally melting retinas, is a feature, not a drawback. So the bad news here is that civilian class laser-based illuminators are simply not strong enough to be useful. Once you diffuse that civilian class laser beam, you're going to notice why the extra power in military units is so critical. The silver lining here is that laser-based diffusion is not the only way to throw large volumes of IR light, and you can accomplish a really similar effect with LEDs. The crappy aluminum lining to that silver lining is that LEDs are typically bulkier than lasers and can throw off the convenience of a compact combined designator / illuminator. The only really viable, no compromise civilian class combined units that I'm aware of are the Steiner D-Ball D2 and the B.E. Myers Maul, both of which are well outside of our budget today. What we can do, however, is separate these into 2 separate devices and get pretty solid capabilities while staying on budget. For my illumination needs, I'm a huge fan of the Inforce WMLX Gen 2 series of weapon lights. These offer highly capable LED-based, visible, as well as infrared flood lighting for only about $150. Not only are these less than half the cost of a Surefire Vampire, but honestly, I actually prefer these to the Vampires. I think the ergonomics of switching from white to IR here is superior to the bezel. I do own Surefire Vampires. They're good products. However, I find the ergonomics here is a little bit better depending on the layout of your particular weapon system. And so, big fan of these. I don't think this is a compromised product, and I use them on things that I'm not limited by budget on. So here we are with $210 left in the budget, and all we need is an IR laser aiming device. For my laser designator, I actually need to cheat a little bit at the end of this video because I don't have the model on hand that I would recommend to complete this build and stay under budget. I do have something very close, however. I'm a huge fan of the Holosun product line, and my model of choice is the LS221G, which offers slaved IR and green vis lasers. The reason I prefer a model that includes a visible laser is because that makes it a lot easier to verify zero under daylight conditions. That said, for bare bones NV effectiveness, you can find the LS117IR for as little as $200, which shaves some weight and loses the visible laser feature. It should also be noted that that does not have an onboard fire button the way this one does and requires the use of a tape switch, but the tape switch is included with the product. So there you have it, guys. Hopefully that's a reasonably viable roadmap to go from being a run-of-the-mill modern rifle owner to having a fully night vision capable loadout for only $2,000 without having to make critical compromises on any of the core functional components. Yes, it will take tactical buying habits and patience, but it is doable. And I know it's doable because I've done it and I'm a normal person. So if I can figure it out, I have no reason to think that you can't figure it out too. All right, sun's going down, folks, so I'm getting excited to actually throw this kit on and enjoy the outdoors at night. So I hope you found this video helpful or at least mildly entertaining. Feel free to pop questions or comments down below. I'm pretty good at responding to them. And if you did find this information valuable, please feel free to let me know you found it helpful by hitting like and subscribe, leaving a comment, all that good stuff. I've got more night vision content coming soon, including a breakdown of my favorite custom-built night vision rifle, the super duper paratrooper Ruger 1022, and plenty more historical content, including my bread and butter, the SKS pattern carbine. Thanks again for watching this video, everybody. Have a great day, and even better yet, have a great night.